Stone vitrification is one of those archaeological facts that sounds impossible the first time you hear it. Yet it appears again and again across the ancient world, carved directly into stone walls that still stand today. In hundreds of ancient sites, massive blocks of granite, basalt, sandstone, and limestone appear partially melted, warped, bubbled, and fused together, as if the stone itself briefly behaved like liquid. Edges are rounded, surfaces are glassy, and individual stones that should be separate are welded into a single mass. This is not erosion. It is not weathering. It is not water damage or slow geological decay. It is stone that has been exposed to temperatures so extreme that its crystalline structure changed, turning solid rock into something closer to glass. And what makes this phenomenon unsettling is not just that it exists, but that it exists in places and time periods where no known technology should have been capable of producing such heat. Vitrification is a well-understood physical process. In modern terms, it occurs when materials rich in silica are heated beyond roughly 1200 degrees Celsius, sometimes much higher depending on the stone type, until their internal lattice collapses and reforms into an amorphous, glass-like state. We achieve this today using industrial furnaces, plasma torches, or controlled nuclear processes. It is not something that happens accidentally in nature, except under very specific violent conditions, such as lightning strikes, meteor impacts, or volcanic activity. Yet many vitrified ruins are nowhere near volcanoes, show no impact craters, and are shaped in deliberate architectural forms. Walls are melted along their outer faces but remain structurally aligned. Stone blocks slump downward as if softened, yet do not scatter as debris would in an explosion. This suggests not chaos, but sustained, directed heat. Across Scotland alone, archaeologists have documented over 60 vitrified forts, many dating back more than 2,000 years. These hill forts, constructed from stone ramparts, display fused walls where rocks appear partially liquefied and then cooled in place. The stones did not crack and fall apart as they would in a normal fire. Instead, they merged. For generations, historians tried to explain this away as the result of large timber fires built into the walls, claiming that ancient people intentionally burned their own forts either to strengthen them or to destroy them. But when modern experiments attempted to recreate vitrification using wood fires, even with massive quantities of fuel, the results fell far short. The heat was insufficient. The fires burned unevenly. The stone fractured rather than melted. To vitrify stone on the scale observed would require temperatures far beyond what open-air combustion can maintain, especially over large surfaces. The phenomenon is not isolated to one region or culture. Vitrified stone appears in ancient sites across France, Germany, Turkey, the Middle East, India, and South America. At Mohenjo-Daro, part of the Indus Valley civilization, bricks show signs of exposure to extreme heat, far exceeding that of normal kiln firing. Some streets appear glazed, as if a thermal wave swept through the city. In the ancient Near East, walls at sites like Hattusa show localized melting inconsistent with siege fires. In Peru, stonework near Sacsayhuaman includes blocks whose surfaces appear softened and molded, with flow patterns frozen in place. These are stones weighing tens or even hundreds of tons, shaped not by chisel marks, but by curvature, bulging edges, and fused seams. What makes vitrification so disturbing to conventional timelines is not just the temperature requirement, but the control implied. Natural disasters produce randomness. Meteor impacts leave craters, shock quartz, and widespread devastation. Volcanic heat leaves ash layers, lava flows, and chemical signatures. But many vitrified sites show none of these. Instead, melting is selective. One wall is affected, another untouched. Upper courses may be glassy, while lower stones remain intact. This pattern suggests exposure to directed energy rather than ambient heat, something applied heat with precision, intensity, and duration, long enough to soften stone but not obliterate the structure entirely. Mainstream archaeology often avoids dwelling on vitrification because it does not fit comfortably into established narratives. It forces uncomfortable questions. If ancient societies did not possess industrial technology, how did they reach such temperatures? If they did possess it, where did it come from? And why does it appear and disappear without leaving behind clear transitional evidence? Some researchers propose that vitrification was accidental, the result of cities burning catastrophically. But this explanation struggles under scrutiny. Urban fires do not melt stone. Even modern city fires, fed by petroleum, steel, and synthetic materials, rarely reach temperatures sufficient to vitrify granite or basalt. Steel may warp, but stone remains largely unaffected. Others suggest ritual destruction, claiming that ancient peoples intentionally burned their structures as symbolic acts. Yet, symbolism does not generate physics-defying heat. No ritual bonfire, no matter how large, can turn megalithic walls into glass. The energy density required is simply too high. Experimental archaeology has tried repeatedly to recreate vitrified walls using ancient materials and techniques, and each time, the results confirm the same conclusion. The observed vitrification cannot be produced with known ancient fire technologies. There is also the unsettling detail that vitrified stone often appears as if it melted rapidly and then cooled quickly. Flow patterns are frozen mid-motion. Drips and bulges suggest brief softening rather than prolonged exposure. This aligns with phenomena seen in high-energy events like plasma exposure or intense electromagnetic discharge. When lightning strikes sand, it creates fulgurites, glassy tubes formed in milliseconds. Multiply that energy by orders of magnitude, spread it across architecture, and you begin to approach what vitrified ruins resemble. Yet, lightning storms capable of vitrifying entire fortresses would leave other unmistakable signs, which are absent. The question then shifts from how to why. Why do these sites exist at all? Why are they so widespread, spanning continents and millennia? Why do they appear in strategic locations, often at fortified sites, ceremonial centers, or major population hubs? One possibility is that vitrification is not a construction technique, but a scar, evidence of an event rather than an intention. Something happened to these places, something powerful enough to rewrite the physical behavior of stone itself. If that is true, vitrified ruins are not architectural curiosities, but historical burn marks, silent witnesses to moments when energy levels exceeded what we associate with ancient history. Some researchers cautiously explore the idea that advanced technologies may have existed in the deep past and were later lost. Not necessarily global industrial civilizations as we imagine today, but localized, specialized knowledge capable of manipulating heat or energy in ways we do not fully understand. This idea is controversial, but vitrification itself is already controversial. The evidence is there, regardless of interpretation. Stone does not melt without cause. Physics does not bend to mythology. Something delivered that energy. What deepens the mystery is the absence of gradual development. There are no half-vitrified learning stages, no experimental failures leading up to success. The phenomenon appears fully formed, then disappears. Sites before and after show normal construction methods. It is as if the knowledge or the event arrived suddenly and vanished just as abruptly. History, as recorded, offers no explanation. Stone vitrification forces us to confront a larger problem in how we view the past. We often assume technological progress is linear, that ancient equals primitive by default. But vitrified ruins do not care about assumptions. They exist, silently contradicting simplified timelines. They demand either unknown natural phenomena or unknown human capabilities. Both options challenge comfort. When you stand before a vitrified wall, you are not just looking at old stone. You are looking at a moment when the rules changed, when solid earth briefly behaved like liquid, when temperatures rivaled those of modern industry or cosmic events. Whatever caused it did not leave instructions or records. It left only altered matter, glassy rock, melted history. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part. These sites suggest that human history may contain chapters written in energy rather than words, events so extreme that they erase themselves, leaving only physical anomalies behind. Stone vitrification is not a mystery because it is rare. It is a mystery because it is common, widespread, and undeniable, yet fundamentally incompatible with what we think ancient humanity was capable of. It is not asking us to believe in fantasy, it is forcing us to explain reality. Across ancient cultures separated by oceans, languages, and millennia, there exists a strange and repeating memory, a memory that refuses to fade no matter how much time passes. Civilizations that never met each other, that shared no trade routes or written contact, all speak of the same impossible event. Fire did not come from torches. It did not come from volcanoes. It did not crawl across the ground or rise from burning cities. Instead, it came from above, from the sky itself. And what makes these accounts deeply unsettling is that when archaeologists examine the physical remains of these places, they often find something missing. No ash layers, no charcoal beds, no soot stains, no widespread residue of ordinary fire, just destruction without combustion, heat without burning, and stone that looks altered without the fingerprints of flame. Ancient texts describe moments when the heavens opened and delivered heat so intense that cities were transformed in seconds. In the Indian epics, entire regions are described as being scorched by a brilliance brighter than 1,000 suns, followed by silence, sickness, and abandonment. Survivors speak of hair falling out, water becoming poisonous, and land becoming uninhabitable. Yet, when researchers search these regions, they do not find thick burn layers consistent with massive fires. Instead, they find vitrified stone, fused brick, and signs of extreme thermal exposure that do not behave like normal combustion. The ground was affected, but not burned. Structures were altered, but not reduced to ash. In the ancient Near East, legends speak of divine judgment arriving as fire from the sky. Cities were said to be erased in moments, their walls collapsing, their inhabitants gone. But excavation layers often tell a different story than the texts suggest. Instead of charcoal and burned debris, some sites show high-temperature alteration of materials without the usual indicators of long-lasting fire. Bricks appear heat-shocked rather than burned. Stones show surface melting but lack smoke staining. The destruction appears instantaneous, as if energy passed through rather than lingered. In the Americas, indigenous oral traditions recount stars falling, sky serpents breathing fire, or glowing objects descending and striking the land. These stories were passed down not as metaphors, but as warnings, as memories of something that once happened and must never be forgotten. Yet, in many of these locations, archaeologists find no evidence of widespread wildfires or volcanic events. Instead, they find abnormal soil chemistry, magnetic anomalies, and stones that appear thermally altered in ways inconsistent with normal environmental processes. The problem with fire from the sky legends is not that they exist. Human cultures tell many dramatic stories. The problem is that the physical evidence sometimes aligns with the heat described, but not with the fire implied. Fire leaves traces. It consumes oxygen. It produces smoke, ash, charcoal, and long-term carbon signatures. Even thousands of years later, these residues remain detectable. But in many of these ancient destruction layers, those markers are strangely absent. Something delivered immense heat without leaving the usual byproducts of burning. Modern science understands that not all heat behaves like fire. Plasma, intense electromagnetic discharge, high-energy radiation, and shock heating can all raise temperatures to extreme levels without producing flames in the conventional sense. Lightning, for example, can instantaneously heat air to temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun, yet it leaves no prolonged burn residue. It alters matter at the molecular level in fractions of a second. Scale that phenomenon up, and you begin to glimpse a mechanism capable of matching ancient descriptions while bypassing the evidence fire should leave behind. This raises an uncomfortable question. Were ancient people describing fire metaphorically because they lacked the language to describe something else? When they said the sky burned, did they mean flames, or did they mean light so intense, heat so sudden, that fire was the closest comparison available? If a civilization witnessed a high-energy atmospheric event, something that struck from above, radiated immense heat, and vanished almost immediately, their only frame of reference would be divine fire. One of the most puzzling aspects is selectivity. Legends often describe specific cities, temples, or fortresses being targeted, while nearby regions remain untouched. Archaeology sometimes confirms this. A single site shows catastrophic alteration, while surrounding settlements show continuity. This pattern does not fit meteor impacts, which devastate wide areas, nor does it fit wildfires, which spread unpredictably. It suggests focused energy delivery rather than natural disaster. There are also cases where legends mention soundless destruction. No roaring flames, no collapsing infernos. Just light, heat, and then silence. This detail matters. Fires are noisy, they crackle, roar, consume, but some high-energy phenomena are eerily quiet, especially at a distance. A burst of radiation, an intense electromagnetic event, or a plasma discharge could deliver lethal heat without the auditory chaos associated with burning cities. Skeptics often argue that these legends are symbolic or exaggerated, but symbolism does not explain vitrified stone without soot. Myth does not melt granite. Poetry does not alter molecular structures. At some point, narrative coincidence gives way to physical causality. Something happened that ancient people struggled to describe, and what they recorded may be a distorted memory of a real, incomprehensible event. Even more troubling is how often these legends emphasize the aftermath rather than the event itself. They speak of lands becoming cursed, people falling ill, water sources becoming deadly, and regions being abandoned for generations. These details resemble not fire damage, but environmental contamination or radiation exposure. Fire destroys, but land recovers. Forests regrow, cities are rebuilt. Yet many of these sites were left empty for centuries, as if something invisible lingered long after the heat was gone. The absence of fire residue paired with evidence of extreme heat creates a contradiction that refuses to resolve cleanly. Either the archaeological record is misleading, or our assumptions about ancient experiences are incomplete. If these were not fires as we understand them, then calling them fire is a linguistic placeholder, not a literal description. It is the shadow of an event too advanced, too sudden, or too alien for the vocabulary of its time. What makes this even more unsettling is the global consistency. The same story repeats with different names: gods, stars, weapons, angels, serpents, wheels of light. Cultures describe what they saw through the lens of belief, but belief does not fabricate heat. Belief does not vitrify walls or alter soil chemistry. The legends may be embellished, but the scars are real. If these events were rare anomalies, they could be dismissed, but they are not. They cluster around important ancient centers, along trade routes, and near sites of advanced construction. This pattern suggests that whatever descended from the sky was not random. It interacted with human civilization at specific points, leaving behind altered landscapes and enduring stories. Legends of fire from the sky persist because something once happened that defied ordinary explanation. The lack of fire residue does not weaken these stories, it strengthens them. It suggests that ancient witnesses were not describing simple burning, but something far more intense and far less understood. Heat without flame, destruction without ash, energy without explanation. When stone melts and legends speak, history is whispering through matter itself, not in words, but in altered rock, in fused walls, in cities that never rose again. The sky may not have burned in the way ancient people imagined, but something came down, something hot enough to change the world and then disappear, leaving humanity with nothing but stories and stone that remembers what we have forgotten. When researchers first encounter certain ancient ruins, the instinctive explanation is war. Siege weapons, fire, invasion, destruction. It feels familiar, comfortable, human. But as more sites are studied in detail, that explanation begins to fracture. The damage patterns simply do not behave like warfare. Walls are not breached in strategic points. Structures are not collapsed inward by impact. There are no concentrations of weapons, no embedded projectiles, no layered debris consistent with prolonged conflict. Instead, what appears again and again are patterns that look less like violence between armies and more like the aftermath of immense energy being released and then vanishing. In many of these sites, stone surfaces show smooth deformation rather than shattering. Corners appear rounded, not broken. Blocks seem to have slumped, sagged, or flowed slightly, as if gravity briefly acted on softened material. Warfare produces fragmentation. It creates sharp breaks, scattered rubble, directional damage. Energy discharge behaves differently. It can heat uniformly across a surface, penetrate material, and alter structure without explosive force. This distinction is crucial because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. At several ancient fortifications, entire walls are affected evenly along long stretches, not at entry points where attackers would logically focus. There is no sign of battering rams, tunneling, or repeated strikes. Instead, stone faces appear heat-altered along their exposed sides, as if something passed over them rather than smashed into them. In some cases, the exterior of a wall is vitrified, while the interior remains relatively untouched, an inversion of what siege fire would produce. Fire used in warfare burns inward, consuming materials inside structures. These sites show the opposite. The damage seems to arrive from outside, from above, or from the surrounding environment itself. Another anomaly lies in vertical consistency. Warfare damage is chaotic. One layer collapses, another survives. Yet, in some ruins, melting or deformation occurs at similar heights across multiple structures, as if a horizontal plane of energy swept through the settlement. Stones at that elevation are affected, while stones above and below are less altered. This kind of pattern is extremely difficult to produce through combat. It suggests exposure to a transient field or wave, not repeated physical strikes. Then there is the absence of defensive aftermath. If a city were destroyed by war, we would expect signs of hurried abandonment, mass burials, weapons left behind, or rebuilding attempts. Yet many of these sites show sudden cessation without recovery. No reconstruction layers, no resettlement, no memorialization of victory or defeat. The place simply stops. It is as if the environment itself became hostile, not politically conquered. Energy discharge events can render areas uninhabitable without leaving obvious physical barriers, something warfare cannot easily explain. Some stones show radial cracking patterns that originate internally rather than from surface impact. This suggests rapid internal heating followed by cooling, creating thermal stress from the inside out. A blow from a weapon transfers force inward. Heat transfer through energy discharge permeates material, exciting molecules throughout the structure. The resulting fractures look fundamentally different. Archaeologists trained to recognize impact damage increasingly acknowledge that these patterns do not align with known military actions from the periods in question. Magnetic anomalies further complicate the warfare narrative. At several sites, stones exhibit altered magnetic properties, as if they were exposed to intense electromagnetic fields. Warfare, even with fire, does not magnetize rock. High-energy electrical or plasma events can. This raises the possibility that some ancient ruins were exposed to phenomena more closely resembling natural or technological energy releases than human conflict. There is also the problem of scale versus intent. Warfare aims to capture, control, or destroy strategically. Energy discharge appears indifferent. It does not target gates. It does not spare infrastructure for reuse. It does not pursue survivors. It alters matter and moves on. Some sites show extreme damage concentrated in ceremonial or monumental areas rather than military targets. This makes little sense for conquest, but aligns with exposure to localized energy phenomena interacting with specific materials or elevations. Even ancient written accounts, when stripped of mythic language, often describe destruction without battle. No armies are named, no enemies identified. The language focuses on light, heat, sound, and suddenness rather than combat. Later interpreters often retroactively impose warfare because it feels historically acceptable, but the physical record does not support that assumption. The idea that these patterns represent energy discharge rather than warfare forces a profound reevaluation. It suggests that ancient societies may have encountered high-energy events beyond their control, events that did not fit into the familiar categories of enemy, weapon, or fire. Whether these were rare natural phenomena, misunderstood technological processes, or something else entirely remains unresolved, what is clear is that the damage left behind does not behave like human violence. When stone flows instead of shatters, when walls soften instead of collapsing, when cities end without conquest, the story changes. These ruins do not whisper of battles lost. They murmur of forces unleashed, briefly, intensely, and then gone. Forces that cared nothing for strategy or survival, forces that acted on matter itself. If warfare explains everything, then nothing is learned. But when patterns refuse to match the explanation, history demands a deeper question. Not who attacked, but what happened. Not who won, but what kind of energy passed through these places and rewrote them at the molecular level. These ruins stand as evidence not of ancient defeat, but of encounters with power that did not need armies to leave its mark. Across the ancient world, carved into stone walls, temple reliefs, and sacred monuments, there exists a strange visual language that has been quietly ignored for centuries. Figures are shown holding objects that do not resemble hammers, chisels, or any known stoneworking tools. Instead, these carvings depict rods, staffs, tubes, boxes, or beam-like extensions aimed directly at stone surfaces. In many of these scenes, the stone is not being struck. It is being touched, directed, or focused upon, and the result is not fragmentation, but softening. The stone appears to sag, flow, or reshape itself, as if it were temporarily transformed into clay. In Egypt, reliefs show elongated objects emitting straight, controlled lines toward massive blocks. These lines are not symbolic flourishes. They are drawn with intent, uniform thickness, and deliberate direction. In some scenes, workers are not exerting physical effort. They are standing calmly, holding devices, while stone blocks appear partially separated, lifted, or reshaped. There is no depiction of pounding, levering, or chiseling. Instead, the emphasis is on alignment and focus, as if the act of shaping stone involved precision rather than force. In South America, particularly in Andean sites, carvings and stone reliefs show figures holding T-shaped or cylindrical objects aimed at polygonal stone blocks. These blocks themselves display characteristics that mirror the imagery: bulging edges, softened seams, and joints so tight that even a blade cannot pass between them. The stones look molded, not cut. The carvings reinforce this impression by depicting stone as something responsive, not resistant. What is striking is the consistency of posture and expression. These figures are not struggling. Their bodies are relaxed. Their hands are steady. This suggests control, not labor. Ancient artists were meticulous in their symbolism. When they wanted to show effort, they exaggerated muscles, strain, and motion. When they wanted to show authority or mastery, they showed stillness. These carvings overwhelmingly depict stillness paired with transformation, implying a method that required knowledge rather than strength. In some Asian temple art, deities or priest figures are shown directing beams of light or energy toward mountains, walls, or solid ground. The stone beneath these beams is often depicted as rippling or layered, as if its structure is being altered. Modern viewers dismiss these images as purely symbolic, but symbolism does not arise in a vacuum. Symbolism reflects how a culture conceptualizes real processes. If stone was always shaped by blunt force, why repeatedly depict it being altered by focused emission? Even more unsettling is how these carvings align with physical evidence. At many sites where such imagery exists, the nearby stonework displays signs of thermal or structural alteration inconsistent with hammering. Tool marks are absent or minimal. Instead, surfaces are smooth, slightly glossy, and curved. Corners are rounded as if once pliable. Stones appear to have been pressed together while soft, fusing seamlessly upon cooling. The carvings and the stone itself appear to be telling the same story in two different languages. Skeptics argue that these images represent mythological powers, gods performing miracles beyond human ability, but this interpretation creates a contradiction. If the process was purely divine, why depict humans holding similar devices? Why show intermediaries, tools, and techniques at all? Many carvings blur the line between God and human, suggesting knowledge passed down rather than unattainable magic. The devices are often shown as objects, not innate abilities. They are held, aimed, and controlled. Another overlooked detail is scale. Some carvings show beams interacting with massive stones far larger than any individual. This implies a method that scales effortlessly, unaffected by weight. That matches what we observe in vitrified or softened stone. Size does not seem to matter. Small stones and enormous blocks show similar deformation patterns. Force-based methods scale poorly. Energy-based methods do not. The idea that ancient cultures depicted advanced stone-softening technology challenges modern assumptions about progress. We expect technology to leave behind machines, metals, and written manuals. But what if the method relied on principles that leave minimal residue? What if the devices were made of materials that decay or were reused endlessly? What if the knowledge itself was more important than the hardware? Ancient artists were not naive. They recorded what mattered. They carved what they understood. When the same visual theme appears across civilizations that never contacted each other, it stops being coincidence. It becomes pattern. And when that pattern aligns with physical anomalies in stone, dismissal becomes avoidance. If these carvings are taken seriously, They suggest that ancient builders may have possessed a method of interacting with stone at a fundamental level, temporarily altering its physical properties rather than fighting against them. Stone did not need to be broken. It could be persuaded, softened, reshaped, then allowed to return to solidity, stronger and more unified than before. These images may not be literal blueprints, but they are not fantasy either. They are memory encoded in art, a visual echo of techniques lost or deliberately abandoned. When stone looks melted, when seams look poured, and when carvings show beams touching rock, the implication is unavoidable. The past may have known ways to work with matter that modern history has not yet relearned, and perhaps that is why these carvings feel so unsettling. They do not show primitive struggle, they show mastery, a calm, precise interaction with stone that contradicts everything we are taught about ancient capability. They suggest that the ruins we see today are not just remnants of lost civilizations, but the hardened aftermath of technologies that once made stone behave like something else entirely. Across the oldest surviving texts on Earth, there are fragments that read less like mythology and more like badly preserved eyewitness reports. They are written in poetic language, wrapped in religious framing, but beneath that layer is a recurring and deeply disturbing claim. Cities were not merely destroyed, they were melted. Not burned, not conquered, melted. The writers struggled to explain what they saw, reaching for the only authority they understood, the gods. Yet the physical descriptions they leave behind are precise, repetitive, and eerily consistent across cultures that never shared a common theology. In the ancient Indian tradition, passages within the Mahabharata describe weapons wielded by gods that unleashed a radiance capable of liquefying entire cities. The text does not linger on flames. Instead, it emphasizes blinding light, unbearable heat, and instant transformation. Structures collapse not from impact, but from softening. The land itself is said to lose its firmness. Rivers boil. Stone becomes brittle or flows. Survivors wander through landscapes that no longer behave as they should. What is most unsettling is the aftermath described. The cities do not simply rebuild. They are abandoned. The land is avoided. The damage lingers long after the light is gone. In Mesopotamia, fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh and related Sumerian texts speak of divine wrath descending from the heavens, flattening cities in moments. The language used is not that of siege or invasion. There are no armies named, no battles described. Instead, the gods decide, the sky changes, and the city is undone. Walls fail as if weakened from within. Brick and stone lose their strength. The destruction is sudden and total, followed by a silence that lasts generations. Archaeologically, some of these cities show abrupt destruction layers without the usual signatures of warfare, reinforcing the idea that the texts may be preserving distorted memories of something non-human in scale. Biblical scripture also contains strikingly physical descriptions when read without theological assumptions. The destruction of cities is often framed as divine fire, but the aftermath does not resemble burned ruins. In some accounts, stones are altered, land is rendered uninhabitable, and the region becomes a wasteland rather than a field of ash. The emphasis is on transformation, not combustion. Salt, glass, and hardened ground replace living cities. The metaphor of fire may be theological, but the physical outcome described is geological. In Mesoamerican codices and oral traditions, later transcribed by early chroniclers, gods are said to descend as glowing beings, unleashing heat that reshapes mountains and cities alike. The stories emphasize light and vibration rather than flame. Cities are described as sinking, warping, or dissolving. Stone temples lose their sharp edges. The ground becomes unstable. These are not metaphors of burning. They are descriptions of material failure under extreme conditions. What ties these script fragments together is not their theology, but their physics. Again and again, writers emphasize intensity over duration. The event is brief, catastrophic, overwhelming. Then it is gone. Fire, as humans experience it, lingers. It spreads. It consumes gradually. But the destruction described in these texts is instantaneous, more akin to a burst of energy than a prolonged blaze. This matches what we see in vitrified ruins, where stone appears to have softened and rehardened quickly, preserving flow-like shapes rather than collapsing into rubble. The authors of these texts clearly struggled with language. They reached for words like fire, light, brilliance, wrath, and judgment, not because they were writing allegory, but because they lacked terminology for what they witnessed. When confronted with phenomena beyond comprehension, humans default to divinity. Calling something the act of gods does not mean it was imaginary. It means it was inexplicable within the cultural framework of the time. Critics often argue that these passages are purely symbolic, moral tales designed to instill fear or obedience. But symbolism does not require technical detail. These texts include specific effects: hair falling out, skin burning without flame, water becoming undrinkable, stone deforming, cities left permanently empty. These are not necessary for moral storytelling. They are observational details, the kind that survive because they mattered to those who lived through them. Another overlooked feature is consistency across translations. While metaphors vary, the core descriptions remain intact even as languages shift. Light from the sky, heat without flame, cities undone in moments, long-term contamination or abandonment. This persistence suggests that later scribes preserved something they did not fully understand but dared not erase. If these fragments are echoes of real events, then the gods described may not be supernatural beings in the modern sense, but placeholders for forces or technologies beyond ancient comprehension. The melting of cities becomes not a divine punishment, but an encounter with energy on a scale humanity was not prepared to interpret. What makes these texts especially unsettling is how well they align with the physical record. Melted stone, vitrified walls, and thermally altered landscapes exist precisely where legends place divine destruction. The stories in the stones appear to be in conversation across time, each reinforcing the other. When script fragments speak of gods melting cities, they may be doing the only thing their authors could do, translating an impossible event into the language of belief. Strip away the theology, and what remains is a description of sudden, overwhelming energy interacting with human civilization, leaving behind scars in stone and memory. These texts are not manuals. They are not explanations. They are trauma records. Humanity's earliest attempt to document encounters with forces that made cities behave like wax and stone behave like liquid. And perhaps the reason they were framed as acts of gods is not because the events were imaginary, but because even now, we still struggle to explain them without reaching for something beyond ourselves. When modern scientists began applying chemical and materials analysis to ancient ruins that appeared melted or deformed, many expected the mystery to finally settle into something mundane. Instead, the opposite happened. The deeper the analysis went, the more uncomfortable the conclusions became. At multiple sites across the world, laboratory results revealed heating levels so extreme that even today, reproducing them requires specialized industrial equipment, controlled environments, and enormous energy input. And yet, these temperatures were reached in open-air ancient settings, without furnaces, without infrastructure, and without any evidence of sustained combustion. Stone is not a simple material. Granite, basalt, limestone, and sandstone each have distinct melting points, crystalline structures, and thermal behaviors. When heated gradually, they fracture, spall, and crumble long before they melt. To actually vitrify them, their internal crystal lattices must be disrupted uniformly. This requires not just high temperature, but rapid energy delivery. Chemical analysis of vitrified stone shows precisely this kind of disruption. Minerals are partially fused, quartz grains are distorted, feldspar phases are altered. These are not the signatures of slow heating or accidental fire. They indicate exposure to temperatures exceeding 1200, 1500, sometimes even 2000 degrees Celsius. What makes this staggering is that such temperatures are not easily achievable even in modern construction environments. Industrial kilns can reach them, but only in enclosed chambers designed to retain heat. Open fires lose energy rapidly to the atmosphere. Even with forced airflow, ancient fuels cannot sustain the necessary thermal density. Yet the chemical signatures in these stones show peak temperatures reached quickly, maintained briefly, and then dropped just as fast. This thermal profile is almost impossible to achieve accidentally. In several sites, microscopic analysis reveals something even stranger. Heat penetration is uneven, in a way that suggests energy passing through material rather than radiating from a surface flame. Some stones show melted interiors, while outer layers remain relatively intact. This inversion defies normal thermodynamics of fire, which heats from the outside inward. To achieve internal melting first, energy must be delivered in a way that excites the material volumetrically, not superficially. This is characteristic of electromagnetic or plasma-based heating, not combustion. Chemical residues also raise questions. Burned stone typically carries traces of carbon, ash, or chemical byproducts of fuel. In many vitrified samples, these are absent. Instead, scientists find clean phase transitions, glass formation without soot inclusion, and mineral changes that imply exposure to pure heat rather than flame. This suggests an energy source that did not rely on burning organic material. Heat without fire. Some sites show evidence of repeated heating events at specific thresholds, as if the energy source was controlled or modulated. The stone was heated just enough to soften and fuse, but not enough to vaporize or explode. This level of precision is astonishing. In modern industry, achieving such controlled heating requires sensors, feedback systems, and careful calibration. Ancient ruins show the results, but none of the supporting machinery. Even more unsettling is the comparison to modern experiments. When scientists attempt to recreate similar vitrification using known methods, they struggle. Gas furnaces crack stone before melting it. Electric kilns cannot replicate the same flow patterns. Plasma torches can produce localized melting, but scaling that effect across large stone blocks in open air remains extremely challenging even now. Yet ancient structures show this effect repeatedly, consistently, and on massive scales. Radiometric analysis sometimes reveals secondary effects as well. Certain stones exhibit altered isotopic ratios consistent with exposure to intense radiation or high-energy particle flux. These anomalies are subtle, often dismissed as contamination or measurement error, but their recurrence across multiple sites is difficult to ignore. Radiation does not leave ash. It leaves changes in atomic structure, changes that last thousands of years. Critics argue that extreme natural events could explain these findings, but nature leaves signatures too. Wildfires leave charcoal. Volcanoes leave lava, ash, and chemical fingerprints unique to magma. Meteor impacts leave shock features and widespread debris fields. Many vitrified sites lack all of these. The chemical evidence points to something else, something that delivered immense energy cleanly, briefly, and precisely. The implications are uncomfortable. Either ancient societies experienced rare, high-energy events we do not yet fully understand, or they possessed access to energy manipulation methods far beyond what we credit them with. Both possibilities challenge the foundation of linear technological history. What makes chemical analysis so powerful is that it does not interpret myths or symbols. It reads matter itself. Molecules do not exaggerate. Crystals do not lie. When stone shows signs of exposure to temperatures rivaling or exceeding modern industrial processes, the question is no longer whether something extraordinary happened, but how. These stones are not guessing. They record thermal history the way tree rings record climate, and their record says that, at certain moments in the past, energy levels surged far beyond what conventional narratives allow. Cities were not just destroyed. They were exposed to forces that pushed materials to their physical limits. Chemical analysis strips away speculation and leaves us with a stark reality. The past, at least in these moments, was not technologically simple. Something happened that heated stone beyond what even today we can easily reproduce, and whatever caused it did so without leaving the comforting explanations we expect. The ruins are not just ancient, they are evidence. Evidence that history contains events powerful enough to melt cities, alter matter at the molecular level, and then vanish, leaving behind nothing but stone that remembers a heat we still struggle to explain. When destruction is caused by chaos, it leaves chaos behind. Random fractures, shattered edges, debris scattered without order. But in many ancient ruins where stone appears melted, something far stranger emerges. The melt lines are not jagged. They are not erratic. They curve. They arc. They coil into spirals, waves, and flowing bands that resemble motion frozen in time. This is not what collapse looks like. This is what energy behavior looks like. At several vitrified sites, close inspection reveals that melted stone did not simply slump downward under gravity. Instead, it followed curved trajectories, looping patterns, and rotational flows. Surfaces appear as if they were briefly caught in a vortex. Melt lines spiral around columns, trace arcs along walls, and converge at focal points. These patterns repeat across structures, suggesting a coherent influence rather than incidental damage. Random destruction does not organize matter. Energy fields do. Spirals are especially telling. In physics, spirals emerge naturally in systems governed by rotation, resonance, and wave interference. Galaxies spiral, magnetic fields coil, plasma arcs twist. Even fluids under rotational force form vortices. When stone exhibits spiral melt patterns, it implies that it was not merely heated, but acted upon by a directional rotating force. This is incompatible with fire, collapse, or impact. Fire spreads outward, explosions radiate, gravity pulls straight down. None of these generate controlled spiral deformation. Some ruins show melt lines wrapping around stones, as if the rock were turned on a lathe. Edges soften and curl, then re-solidify in smooth, continuous motion. The stone appears to have flowed while retaining cohesion, not splashing or fragmenting. This suggests a brief phase where the material entered a plastic state under a structured influence. In modern physics, achieving this requires precise energy input combined with field control. Heat alone is insufficient. What makes this even more unsettling is consistency. Spirals appear at similar orientations across different stones within the same site. They are not random swirls caused by uneven heating. They align. They mirror each other. This implies that the stones were responding to a common external condition, not isolated accidents. When multiple objects deform in harmony, the cause is systemic. In some cases, melt lines curve upward against gravity. Stone appears to have flowed sideways or even risen slightly before cooling. This defies expectations of simple melting, where gravity dominates motion. Instead, it suggests the presence of forces counteracting gravity, at least briefly. Electromagnetic fields can do this. Plasma interactions can do this. Conventional destruction cannot. Archaeologists trained to look for battle damage often overlook these patterns because they do not fit familiar categories. But materials scientists recognize them instantly. They resemble flow lines seen in high-energy manufacturing processes, where metals or ceramics are shaped using electromagnetic or plasma-based methods. The difference is scale. These ancient examples occur on megalithic stone, in open air, without machines. Spiral melt patterns also indicate duration. Not prolonged time, but enough time for material to respond dynamically. A meteor impact delivers heat too fast and too violently, producing shock fracturing rather than graceful flow. Wildfires are too slow and uneven. The patterns we see suggest a narrow window where energy was intense, sustained briefly, and then withdrawn. A pulse, not a blaze. Some sites even show nested spirals, smaller curves within larger ones, hinting at harmonic resonance. This is what happens when waves interfere constructively, reinforcing certain pathways while leaving others untouched. Stone seems to have been guided into specific shapes, as if following invisible lines of force. Random destruction cannot create resonance. It only erases. The presence of spirals also undermines the idea of accidental vitrification. Accidents are messy. They do not repeat elegant geometry across different materials and locations. Geometry implies rule. Rule implies mechanism. What kind of mechanism could impose spiral energy patterns on stone? The answer remains speculative, but the evidence narrows the field. It must involve fields rather than contact, influence rather than impact, control rather than chaos. Whether natural or technological, it represents a class of phenomena far removed from warfare, fire, or simple disaster. Perhaps ancient witnesses describe these events as divine because they saw stone move like liquid, obeying invisible commands. Perhaps they watched walls soften, twist, and freeze mid-motion, leaving behind patterns no hammer could carve. Whatever the explanation, the spirals remain, etched not by artists, but by forces acting directly on matter. Melt lines that curve, coil, and converge tell a story that straight cracks never could. They speak of moments when stone was caught in motion, shaped by energy that followed rules we are only beginning to recognize. Not random destruction, but organized transformation. Not collapse, but controlled alteration. And that is what makes these ruins so unsettling. They do not look like the aftermath of something breaking. They look like the aftermath of something being used. Throughout history, there have been persistent rumors that sit in an uncomfortable space between myth and suppressed memory. Not legends of swords or spears, not stories of armies clashing, but whispers of weapons that did not strike, cut, or burn in any familiar way. These accounts speak instead of devices capable of altering matter itself, of tools that could make solid things lose their solidity, that could loosen the bonds between molecules and force reality to briefly behave by different rules. What makes these rumors so disturbing is how closely they echo the physical evidence left behind in melted ruins. Ancient texts rarely describe these weapons directly. Instead, they circle around them, as if the writers themselves did not fully understand what they were witnessing. They speak of thunder without sound, light without flame, destruction without debris. Walls are said to weaken, towers to sag, cities to collapse inward rather than explode outward. Stone does not shatter, it fails. This language is not consistent with conventional weapons. It suggests a mechanism that bypasses impact and heat in the ordinary sense, and instead targets structure at a deeper level. In several traditions, these weapons are described as gifts from higher beings or relics of an earlier age. The emphasis is not on craftsmanship, but on knowledge. The power is often said to reside in understanding rather than brute force. This distinction matters. Primitive weapons amplify muscle. Advanced weapons manipulate physics. When ruins show evidence of molecular disruption rather than mechanical damage, the rumors begin to feel less fantastical. Some accounts describe cities becoming soft, as if the ground itself betrayed those standing on it. Floors ripple, walls lose cohesion. Structures lean and freeze in distorted positions. These effects resemble what materials scientists observe when bonds between atoms are temporarily weakened. In modern laboratories, similar effects can be induced using intense electromagnetic fields, particle beams, or extreme thermal gradients. These processes do not smash matter. They destabilize it from within. What makes the idea of lost molecular weapons especially unsettling is their precision. Rumors often emphasize control. Entire regions are not obliterated. Specific sites are affected. Sometimes a single city, sometimes a single structure. This selectivity aligns with what we see archaeologically. Melted stone appears in discrete locations, not spread randomly across landscapes. Warfare spreads destruction. Energy-based manipulation can be focused. There are also recurring warnings embedded in these stories. The weapons are described as dangerous not just to enemies, but to those who wield them. Users suffer sickness, madness, or exile. Lands become poisoned or forbidden. Knowledge is sealed away. These themes echo the realities of modern high-energy technologies, where radiation, contamination, and long-term environmental damage are serious risks. Fire swords do not poison land. Molecular disruption might. In some traditions, these weapons are said to predate the civilizations that later recorded them. They are remnants of a previous world, an earlier cycle, an age that ended catastrophically. Survivors inherit ruins, but not understanding. This would explain why the physical evidence exists without accompanying technical documentation. The users were gone, the knowledge was lost or intentionally buried. Skeptics argue that such stories are metaphorical, cautionary tales about hubris. But metaphors do not leave altered stone. Allegory does not rearrange crystal lattices. When chemical analysis shows matter was pushed beyond normal thresholds, and stories speak of powers that made stone behave unnaturally, dismissal becomes less convincing. Modern physics acknowledges that the molecular bonds can be manipulated. We do it on small scales every day. Lasers can alter surfaces. Particle accelerators can transmute elements. Electromagnetic fields can change material properties. The difference is scale and intent. Today, such technologies are carefully controlled and localized. The ruins suggest something broader, more forceful, applied in the open world. The rumors persist because they are anchored to places. People point to melted walls, warped blocks, fused stones, and say, "This is where it happened." Not everywhere, here. The stories do not float freely. They cling to geography, to scars in the landscape that refuse to fade. If weapons capable of shifting molecular structure once existed, even briefly, they would redefine how we understand ancient power. They would blur the line between tool and force of nature. And if they were lost, intentionally destroyed, or forbidden, that loss may not be an accident. Such power, once unleashed, leaves more than ruins. It leaves fear. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is not whether these weapons existed, but how little separates rumor from reality. The physical effects described are not impossible. They are merely extreme, and extreme events do not need to happen often to leave lasting marks. One use is enough to melt a city. One failure is enough to erase a technology from history. The rumors of lost weapons linger because they explain too much too neatly. They bridge the gap between melted stone and ancient testimony, between physics and myth. Whether they represent misunderstood natural phenomena or forgotten human capability remains unresolved, but the idea refuses to die because the evidence refuses to disappear. Stone that flows, walls that sag, cities that end without battle. These are not the signatures of swords or fire. They are the fingerprints of something that reached deeper, touched the bonds holding matter together, and then vanished, leaving behind ruins that look less destroyed than transformed. There is a quieter mystery surrounding vitrified ruins that receives far less attention than melted stone itself, yet it may be just as revealing. It is not written in legends or carved into walls. It exists in silence, in emails unanswered, in papers never submitted, in studies abandoned before peer review. Again and again, researchers who encounter vitrification in the field describe the same experience. Once the implications become clear, the conversation stops. Vitrification sits in an uncomfortable space within modern science. The phenomenon is real. The evidence is physical, measurable, repeatable. Yet, the moment researchers attempt to frame it in a way that challenges established historical or technological timelines, resistance appears. Not always overt, not always malicious, often subtle. A suggestion to focus on something safer. A reminder that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. A warning that funding committees prefer conventional interpretations. Slowly, the incentive to push further disappears. Many geologists and archaeologists will openly discuss vitrification in private conversations. They will acknowledge that the temperatures implied by chemical analysis exceed what ancient societies should have been able to produce. They will admit that fire-based explanations are weak. But when it comes to publishing, the language shifts. The phenomenon is reframed as poorly understood, likely ritual burning, or anomalous but unresolved. The conclusion is softened until it no longer threatens the broader narrative. Peer review is designed to filter out error, but it also filters out disruption. Journals rely on reviewers deeply invested in existing frameworks. A paper suggesting that ancient sites experienced energy levels rivaling modern industrial processes invites scrutiny not just of data, but of worldview. Reviewers may not find explicit faults in methodology, yet still recommend rejection on the grounds that conclusions are speculative, outside scope, or unsupported by historical context. The data may be sound. The implications are not welcome. This creates a paradox. Vitrification cannot be denied, so it is minimized. It is acknowledged but isolated, treated as an oddity rather than a clue. Each site is studied independently, stripped of connection to others. Patterns are avoided. Comparative studies across continents are rare, not because the data is lacking, but because the conclusions would be uncomfortable. Publishing one melted wall is manageable. Publishing a global pattern is not. Some researchers have spoken anonymously about career pressure. A young academic who publishes a paper questioning the limits of ancient technology risks being labeled fringe. Grant applications become harder. Collaborations dry up. Conference invitations disappear. The system does not need to censor overtly. It simply rewards conformity. Over time, researchers learn which questions lead to careers and which lead to dead ends. Even interdisciplinary research faces barriers. A materials scientist might identify plasma-like effects in stone, but defer historical interpretation. An archaeologist might document melting, but avoid discussing heat sources. Each discipline stays in its lane. The space between lanes, where vitrification actually lives, remains empty. No one wants ownership of a problem that does not resolve cleanly. This reluctance is often framed as scientific caution, but caution becomes avoidance when anomalies persist for decades without resolution. Vitrified forts have been known for centuries. Melted stone in ancient cities has been documented repeatedly. Chemical analyses continue to confirm extreme heating. At what point does restraint become denial? There is also the issue of narrative stability. History is not just a record of the past, it is a structure that supports education, identity, and continuity. Introducing evidence that suggests unknown high-energy events or lost technological capabilities destabilizes that structure. It raises questions with no immediate answers. Institutions tend to resist such uncertainty, not out of conspiracy, but out of institutional inertia. The result is a gap between what is known and what is said. Vitrification exists in footnotes rather than headlines. It is mentioned briefly, then passed over. Students learn of ancient construction techniques that rely on labor and time, while the melted stone in the background goes unexplained. Silence becomes the default explanation. What makes this especially troubling is that science advances precisely by confronting anomalies. Every major shift in understanding began as an uncomfortable data point. Yet, vitrification remains frozen in limbo, acknowledged but not integrated. The stones speak, but the journals remain quiet. This refusal to publish does not mean the phenomenon is false. It means it is unresolved in a way that challenges more than data. It challenges assumptions, and assumptions are often defended more fiercely than facts. Until vitrification is allowed to be discussed openly, without being pre-framed as ritual, accident, or anomaly, it will remain a ghost in the archaeological record. Not because it lacks evidence, but because it demands a story science is not yet ready to tell. The melted stones remain in the open, weathering quietly. They do not argue, they do not publish. They simply exist, bearing witness to temperatures, forces, and events that our current narratives struggle to contain. And perhaps the most telling sign that vitrification matters is not the heat it required, but the silence it still produces. When we look at ancient sites where stone appears melted, warped, or fused, the word destroyed comes automatically. It feels natural. Destruction is familiar. It fits history books. But the more closely these places are examined, the more that word begins to feel inaccurate. Because destruction implies chaos, collapse, and loss of form. What we see instead often looks intentional, structured, and strangely incomplete, which forces an uncomfortable question to the surface. Were these cities truly destroyed, or were they reshaped into something else? Destruction leaves signatures. Buildings collapse inward. Roofs fall first. Walls fracture at stress points. Debris piles up in layers that reflect gravity and time. Warfare leaves directional damage. Fire leaves ash. Earthquakes leave fault patterns. Yet many of these melted ruins do not follow those rules. Walls remain standing but altered. Stones are fused rather than scattered. Structures lose sharp edges but keep their alignment. The city does not look smashed, it looks softened. In some places it appears as though the city was caught mid-transition. Stone blocks bulge outward slightly, as if pressure came from within. Corners round off instead of breaking. Seams between stones tighten instead of separating. This is not how buildings fail when attacked or burned. This is how materials behave when their internal structure is briefly changed, when rigidity gives way to plasticity, and then returns to solidity before gravity or time can finish the job. If a city were destroyed, we would expect its materials to revert to disorder. Instead, many of these sites show increased cohesion. Individual stones are fused into monolithic masses stronger than before. Walls become harder, not weaker. In some vitrified forts, the melted stone has actually improved structural integrity, making the walls more resistant to erosion. Destruction rarely strengthens what it touches. Transformation often does. Another clue lies in what is missing. Destroyed cities usually leave human traces behind. Bodies, tools, personal objects, signs of panic or escape. Yet some melted sites show a sudden cessation of occupation without the expected chaos. It is as if the city was emptied, altered, and then left behind. Not looted, not reused, not rebuilt. This feels less like defeat and more like abandonment following a fundamental change. Reshaping also explains selectivity. In many sites, only certain structures are affected: temples, walls, central complexes. Residential areas nearby may remain intact. Warfare does not respect architectural importance. Energy-based phenomena might. If stone responds differently based on composition, geometry, or placement, then some buildings would be altered while others are spared. The city is not erased uniformly, it is edited. The idea of reshaping also aligns with ancient testimony. Many legends do not describe annihilation. They describe transformation. Cities become forbidden, sacred, cursed, altered. The language often implies that the place itself changed character, not just that it was ruined. People avoid returning, not because nothing is left, but because something remains that no longer feels safe or familiar. From a materials perspective, reshaping makes more sense than destruction. The temperatures and energy levels implied by vitrification are sufficient to soften stone, but not necessarily vaporize it. This creates a window where matter can move, flow, and settle into new forms. Once the energy is removed, the stone locks into place again, preserving motion like a fossilized wave. The city becomes a snapshot of a process, not a pile of wreckage. If these events were purely destructive, we would expect repetition. Wars recur, fires happen again. Earthquakes revisit the same faults. Yet many of these cities experience a singular event, then nothing. No rebuilding, no second strike, just silence. That suggests an event rather than a conflict, a phenomenon rather than a campaign. Reshaping also raises a more disturbing possibility. If stone can be altered in this way, then cities may not have been targets, but mediums. The structures themselves may have been involved in the process, interacting with energy in ways we do not yet understand. The result was not meant to erase the city, but to change it, intentionally or as a side effect. This reframes the ruins entirely. They stop being evidence of failure and start looking like evidence of interaction. Something acted upon these cities, not to wipe them out, but to impose a different physical state upon them. Whether that was accidental, experimental, defensive, or catastrophic remains unknown. But the outcome does not resemble simple destruction. Perhaps the most unsettling thought is this: if the cities were reshaped rather than destroyed, then what we see today is not a ruin, but a finished product. Not a collapse frozen in time, but a transformation completed. The stone cooled, the energy withdrew, and the city was left exactly as it was meant to remain. We stand among these melted walls, assuming we are looking at the aftermath of violence. But what if we are actually looking at the aftermath of a process we no longer recognize? A process that treated cities not as targets, but as material. If that is true, then the question is no longer what destroyed these places. The question becomes far more unsettling. What were they being turned into?